The 7th of January, 610, in the city of Padua, long after the streets have gone quiet, a 45-year-old professor climbs to his window, carrying a tube of wood and leather he built with his own hands. He points it at Jupiter. Beside the planet, he sees 3 small stars that no chart has ever recorded. The next night, they have moved. Within a week, he understands what he is looking at, and he understands something else. The sky described in every textbook and taught in every university in Europe is wrong. How does the son of a musician come to hold evidence against the entire cosmos? Why would the most famous scientist in Italy risk everything to defend what his own eyes had seen? And what does it cost a man to be right too early? Tonight we follow the complete life of Galileo Galilei, from a workshop in Pisa to a Roman courtroom to a blind old man still working in the dark. So take a slow breath. Let the modern world fade away. We are going back to Italy, to the year 1564. This is where the story begins. Pisa, in the winter of 1564, was a city living quietly inside the shell of its own past. Its great days as a maritime power were centuries gone. The river Arno moved through the centre of town, slow and grey in the cold months. Past churches and merchant houses built with money the city no longer had, the famous bell tower already leaned. It had been leaning for 300 years, and the people of Pisa had long since stopped finding it remarkable. It was simply part of the landscape, a daily reminder that even the most careful human plans do not always behave the way their designers intended. Into this city, on the 15th of February, 1564, a child was born and given the name Galileo Galilei. The year itself is worth a moment of quiet attention. 3 days after Galileo was born, Michelangelo Buonarroti died in Rome at the age of 88, and in April of that same year, in a small English market town called Stratford-upon-Avon, William Shakespeare was baptized. The age of the Renaissance masters was closing in the same season that 2 of the minds who would define the next age were arriving. No one in Pisa knew this. Of course, history never announces its turning points. It simply keeps moving and leaves the pattern for later generations to notice. The family the boy was born into was respectable, educated, and almost permanently short of money. The Galilei name still carried some weight in Tuscany. An ancestor named Galileo Bonaiuti had been a celebrated physician in Florence in the 1400s, so celebrated that the family had changed its surname in his honour. But by the 1560s, the prestige had outlived the fortune. The boy's father, Vincenzo Galilei, was a musician. He played the lute with real skill. He taught, he composed, and he traded in wool on the side, because music alone could not feed a household that would grow to include 6 or 7 children, of whom Galileo was the eldest. If this were only the story of a struggling musician, Vincenzo would deserve a sentence, and no more. He deserves far more, because the most valuable thing Galileo ever inherited was not money and not a name. It was a habit of mind, and it came straight from his father. Vincenzo Galilei was not simply a performer. He was a music theorist, standing inside one of the significant intellectual arguments of his time. In Florence, he belonged to the circle of musicians and scholars gathered around Count Giovanni de Bardi, a group later known as the Florentine Camerata, and in 1581 he published a book called The Dialogue on Ancient and Modern Music. In its pages, he attacked the most respected musical authority in Italy, his own former teacher, Giuseppe Zarlino. The disagreement sounds technical. Listen instead to what was truly at stake. For 2,000 years, musical theory had rested on the authority of Pythagoras, who taught that harmony was governed by simple, beautiful ratios of whole numbers. The theory was elegant. It was ancient. It was endorsed by virtually every learned man in Europe. And Vincenzo did something almost no one thought to do. He tested it. He stretched strings across the room, hung weights from them, changed their tension and their length, and listened. His ears told him that the sacred numbers did not behave the way the books promised. The relationship between tension and pitch followed a different rule than the pure Pythagorean theory claimed. According to historians of science, including the scholar Stillman Drake, who spent much of his career with the Galilei family papers, those trials with strings and weights rank among the earliest genuine experiments in the modern sense. Not thought experiments, not appeals to ancient texts, physical trials with real objects, where the outcome was allowed to contradict the authority. Now picture the house where this was happening, a crowded home, first in Pisa and later in Florence, where the family moved when Galileo was about 10, strings stretched between chairs, weights hanging in the lamplight, a father plucking, adjusting, listening, writing down what he heard, late into the evening, and a boy watching from the edge of the room. To that boy, this was simply what his father did after supper. He could not have known he was watching a revolution in miniature, but something passed across that room, night after night, and it can be said in one sentence: when the book and the experiment disagree, believe the experiment. Vincenzo even wrote, in his dialogue, that those who rely on authority alone, without offering evidence, argue absurdly. His son would spend an entire lifetime acting on that idea, and would one day pay a price for it that his father could never have imagined. There was music in the inheritance too, and it should not be passed over. Galileo learned the lute from his father and played it well for the rest of his life. Decades from now, old and blind and confined to a hillside house, he will still reach for it in the evenings. Keep that image somewhere gentle, the way a piece of music keeps its final chord hidden inside the opening bars. The boy's schooling began in Pisa and continued near Florence, at the monastery of Vallombrosa in the wooded hills southeast of the city, a house of the Vallombrosan monks. The education was serious and traditional. Latin, Greek, logic, religion, and the teenage Galileo did something there that surprises people who know only the later chapters of his life. He loved it. The quiet, the order, the study. He entered the community as a novice, taking the first step toward becoming a monk. His father removed him. The official reason was an eye inflammation needing treatment in Florence. Whether the eye trouble was the whole story, or simply a convenient occasion, the record does not settle, and it is better to admit that than to decorate it. What is beyond doubt is Vincenzo's motive afterward. He had watched brilliance struggle against poverty his entire adult life, and he was determined his eldest son would not repeat the pattern. A monk earned nothing, a musician earned little, but a physician, in the tradition of the great ancestor whose name the family carried, earned a comfortable living. So the decision was made. In the practical way, fathers of limited means have always made such decisions. The boy would go to the University of Pisa. He would study medicine. He would restore the family fortunes and honour its most illustrious name. It was a perfectly sensible plan, built with the same care as the bell tower, standing a few streets from where Galileo was born. And like the bell tower, it was about to lean in a direction no one had designed, because in a lecture hall in Pisa, a young medical student was going to overhear a lesson in geometry, and in a cathedral in the same city, he was going to look up at a swinging lamp and see something that everyone else had watched for centuries without ever truly seeing. In the fall of 1581, at 17 years old, Galileo Galilei enrolled at the University of Pisa as a student of medicine. The university he entered was old, browed, and deeply conservative. Medicine in the 1580s was not taught at the bedside or in a laboratory. It was taught from books, and the books were ancient. Students memorized the works of Galen, a Greek physician who had died more than 1400 years earlier, and the natural philosophy of Aristotle, who had died 3 centuries before Galen. The method of instruction was simple. The professor read the text aloud, explained what it meant, and resolved any apparent contradiction in favour of the text. The idea that a student might test a claim against the world itself had no place in the curriculum. The claim had already been settled, long ago, by men whose authority it was not a student's place to question. Imagine how those lecture halls felt to a young man who had grown up watching his father hang weights from lute strings to prove the ancient authorities wrong. The lectures offered conclusions. His whole childhood had trained him to ask for evidence. The friction began almost at once, and the records of his student years suggest he did not hide it. He earned a reputation among his professors as a contrarian, a young man who raised objections in rooms where objections were not the custom. Some accounts say his fellow students nicknamed him the Wrangler. Whether or not the nickname is precisely documented, the behaviour behind it certainly is, because it never changed for the rest of his life. And then there is the lamp. The story is one of the most famous in the history of science, so it must be handled with care and with honesty, according to Vincenzo Viviani, who was Galileo's last student and his first biographer. The young Galileo was attending a service in the Cathedral of Pisa when his attention drifted upward to a lamp hanging from the ceiling on a long chain. Someone had lit it and left it swinging. Galileo watched the swings grow shorter as the lamp settled, and noticed something strange. Whether the arc was wide or narrow, each swing seemed to take the same amount of time. He had no clock to test this, so he used the only timekeeper he carried, the beating of his own pulse, a tool he knew from his medical training. Wide swing or small swing, the count of heartbeats stayed the same. Now, the honest part. Viviani wrote that account decades after the fact, long after Galileo had become famous, and Viviani had a well-documented fondness for polishing his teacher's legend. Historians also point out that the great bronze lamp, shown to visitors in Pisa today, was installed in 1587, after Galileo's student years, though an older lamp did hang in the cathedral before it. so no one can promise you the scene happened exactly this way. In that building, on that day, what can be promised is something better than the legend. Galileo's own notebooks and letters show that he studied the pendulum throughout his life, that he established the principle that a pendulum's timing depends on the length of its cord rather than the width of its swing, and that near the end of his life he designed a clock regulated by a pendulum, an idea the Dutch scientist Christiaan Huygens successfully built in 1657. The lamp may be legend. The discovery is not, even as a story, though the lamp reveals something true. Hundreds of people sat in that cathedral. Everyone could see the lamp. Only one person thought the lamp was asking a question. That difference between looking and seeing, between watching a thing move and wondering why it moves that way, is the difference this whole life will be built on, and it is fair to wonder, softly, in the dark, how many swinging lamps pass through an ordinary week of our own lives. Unexamined, the lamp did not change Galileo's course. A chance encounter with a mathematician did. The Tuscan court travelled with the seasons, and when it resided in Pisa, it brought its official tutors along. One of them was Ostilio Ricci, a mathematician who taught the court pages, trained in the tradition of Niccolò Tartaglia, the great translator of Archimedes. Sometime around 1583, Galileo, then about 19, came upon a lesson in geometry, the traditional version, from Viviani again, says he listened secretly outside the door, drawn in despite himself. However, the first contact happened. What followed is documented. Galileo sought Ricci out. He began studying Euclid privately, then devoured Archimedes, and in Archimedes, in the mathematics of levers and floating bodies and centres of gravity, he found what medicine had never offered him, a description of the physical world that could be tested, measured, and proved. Galileo asked Ricci to speak with his father. Ricci did, and Vincenzo Galilei, the man who had defied his own teacher in print, now faced the same rebellion from the other side of the table. He had staked the family's future on a medical career, and medicine paid many times what a mathematician could earn. The negotiation between father and son stretched on. But Vincenzo was arguing with his own reflection, and he seems to have known it. He gave way, first quietly permitting the mathematics, then accepting what could not be stopped. In 1585, Galileo left the University of Pisa without a degree. Let that settle for a breath, because it is not a small detail. The man who would remake the sciences walked out of university with no diploma, no position, and no income, at 21 years old. What he carried out of Pisa instead was a method and a hero. The method was his father's. Test the claim. The hero was Archimedes, living proof that mathematics and the physical world were not separate kingdoms. For the next 4 years he tutored students privately in Florence and Siena, wrote a small treatise on a hydrostatic balance for weighing precious metals, and worked on centres of gravity, mailing his results to established mathematicians, the way an unknown writer mails out manuscripts. One of them, Guidobaldo del Monte, a nobleman with real influence, saw the talent in those pages and became his first great patron, and in 1589, through Guidobaldo's support, the university that had watched Galileo leave as a dropout hired him back as its professor of mathematics. He was 25. He was returning to the very halls where his professors had read Aristotle aloud as settled truth, and he was carrying a question Aristotle had answered 2,000 years earlier, an answer the entire world accepted, and that Galileo was now prepared to doubt out loud. The question was almost childishly simple. When things fall, how do they fall? Every schoolchild in Europe knew the answer, because Aristotle had given it. Heavy objects fall faster than light ones, in proportion to their weight. A stone of 10 pounds falls 10 times faster than a stone of 1 pound. The answer had the great advantage of sounding obvious. Drop a feather and a hammer hammer wins. 20 centuries of scholars had nodded and moved on. The new professor of mathematics at Pisa did not nod. His salary was 60 florins a year, among the lowest in the university, while the professor of medicine earned some 2,000. He was young, underpaid, already carrying family debts, and constitutionally unable to leave a settled question alone. In the 3 years that followed, he began composing a manuscript he called De Motu, on motion, which survives today, and which shows a mind in the act of taking Aristotle apart, argument by argument. His first weapon was not an experiment at all. It was pure reasoning, and it remains one of the most elegant arguments in the history of thought. So walk through it slowly. Once, before sleep. Suppose Aristotle is right, and heavy bodies fall faster than light ones. Now take a heavy stone and a light stone and tie them together with a cord. The light stone, falling more slowly, should drag against the heavy one and slow it down, so the pair should fall slower than the heavy stone alone. But wait, tied together, the two stones are also a single object, heavier than either one, so the pair should fall faster than the heavy stone alone. The same assumption has produced two opposite conclusions. When an assumption contradicts itself, the assumption is wrong. No tower required. Aristotle falls in a paragraph. But of course there is a tower in this story, and you are owed the truth about it. The image everyone carries. Galileo at the top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, dropping 2 cannonballs before a crowd of astonished professors, comes to us once again from Viviani. Writing more than 60 years after the supposed event, Galileo himself, in all his surviving books and letters, never mentions performing such a demonstration. Most historians today treat the scene as legend, or at best an embellished memory of something far less theatrical. And here is the detail that makes the honest version more interesting than the myth. A Dutch engineer named Simon Stevin actually did perform a version of the experiment around 1586, dropping lead weights from a church tower in Delft and publishing the result. The theatrical staging belongs to legend. The truth belongs to slow, unglamorous, patient work. And that work was Galileo's, though its finest hours still lay ahead of him, because the real problem with studying falling bodies is embarrassingly practical. Falling is fast, and the 1590s had no stopwatch. A stone dropped from a tower reaches the ground in about 3 heartbeats. How do you measure something that is over almost before it begins? Galileo's answer was the kind of move that separates genius from mere cleverness. If you cannot slow down time, slow down the fall. Roll a bronze ball down a gently sloping wooden channel. And gravity still does the work, but stretched across seconds instead of instants. Then measure time with water running from a vessel into a cup, weighing the water collected during each stage of the roll. He began this line of attack in his Pisan years. But the decisive, carefully measured trials would come later, in another city, in the happiest period of his life. Filling notebooks that historians located and studied in the 20th century, pages of real, measured numbers confirming that the experiments were carried out with remarkable precision. We will stand beside those ramps soon. What the rolling balls eventually revealed was a pattern hiding inside every fall since the beginning of the world. In the first interval of time, the ball covers 1 unit of distance. In the second interval, 3 units. In the third, 5. The odd numbers 1, 3, 5, 7, marching in order. Add them up as you go, and the totals are 1, 4, 9, 16. The squares. Distance grows with the square of time, and the weight of the falling thing has nothing to do with it. Falling is not chaos. Falling is geometry, unfolding at a fixed and knowable rate. Stay with that thought a moment longer, because it is larger than it sounds. What those ramps uncovered was among the first clean pieces of evidence that nature runs on mathematics all the way down. That, beneath the mess of wind and friction and circumstance, the world keeps exact accounts. Every bridge that stands today, every aircraft that lands safely, every spacecraft that arrives at a distant planet on the predicted day, descends in a straight line from the discovery that motion obeys equations. It began with a young man, a wooden ramp, and dripping water. His colleagues at Pisa were not grateful for any of it. Galileo attacked Aristotle in the classroom, mocked university customs, and wrote a satirical poem against the regulation requiring professors to wear their academic gowns in public, arguing that solemn clothing was a kind of packaging that let fools pass for wise men. The senior faculty, men whose careers rested on the settled answers, closed ranks. When his contract came up for renewal in 1592, the outcome was never in doubt. That same period brought a heavier blow. In 1591, Vincenzo Galilei died, and the eldest son inherited the debts and duties of the household, including dowries promised for his sisters, obligations that would follow him for decades. He was 27, unemployed, and responsible for a family. But Guidobaldo del Monte had not stopped working on his behalf. Beyond the borders of Tuscany, in the territory of the Republic of Venice, stood the University of Padua, wealthier, prouder, and above all freer than Pisa, because Venice answered to no duke and bowed only reluctantly to Rome. Its chair of mathematics happened to be vacant. In the autumn of 1592, Galileo travelled north, delivered a trial lecture that reportedly left the examiners entirely persuaded, and won the appointment at 3 times his Pisan salary. He would later call the 18 years that followed the happiest of his life. He did not know that yet. Standing at the gates of Padua with his debts and his manuscripts, he only knew he had escaped. Waiting for him inside those gates were love, children, the best friends he would ever have, and, in a rumour from Holland 17 years away, a toy made of glass that would change the sky. the Republic of Venice, at the end of the 1500s, was unlike any other place in Italy. It was a state built on water and commerce, ruled not by a prince, but by a council of merchant families who had learned across 8 centuries of trading with every port in the known world that prosperity requires a certain freedom of thought. Venice printed more books than almost any city in Europe. Venice welcomed foreigners, tolerated argument, and kept the authority of Rome at a careful arm's length. And 25 miles inland from the lagoon, the Republic maintained its university at Padua as a matter of state pride, hiring the best minds it could find and protecting them once they arrived. For a man just pushed out of Pisa for asking too many questions, arriving in Padua in the fall of 1592 must have felt like surfacing from underwater. He gave his inaugural lecture that December at 28 years old, and settled into work that was heavier than it sounds. His public lectures covered geometry and astronomy, and the astronomy he was paid to teach was the old astronomy, the Earth-centered system of Ptolemy, because that is what medical students needed for their astrology. Hold that thought gently as we go. For years, the man who would prove the old sky wrong earned his bread by teaching it. The real work happened at home, to pay the family debts, the dowries, the endless obligations that had followed him from Florence. Galileo turned his house into something between a boarding school and a workshop. Young noblemen from across Europe came to live with him and study privately. Fortification, mechanics, surveying, the practical mathematics. A future officer or administrator needed, around 1597, to supply his students with tools. He designed a brass instrument he called the geometric and military compass, a calculating device that could help a gunner set the elevation of a cannon or a merchant work out exchange rates. He manufactured it, sold it, wrote an instruction manual, taught courses on its use, and around 1599 he brought an instrument maker named Marcantonio Mazzoleni to live in the house with his family and run a workshop on the ground floor. It was, in the language of our own century, a start-up, operating out of a professor's home, and it mattered for a reason far beyond money. Years before Galileo pointed anything at the sky, his hands already knew how instruments were made, how brass and glass behaved, how a device could extend what a human being is able to do. That knowledge was waiting for its moment. The same year the compass appeared, 1597. A book arrived in the mail that opens a window into Galileo's private mind. It was the Mysterium Cosmographicum, sent by a young German mathematician named Johannes Kepler, a convinced follower of Copernicus, the Polish astronomer who had proposed back in 1543 that the Earth travels around the Sun. Galileo wrote back, and the letter survives. In it he confessed that he had privately held the Copernican view for some years, that the moving Earth explained things the old system could not, and then he added the sentence historians have quoted ever since. He had not dared to publish, he wrote, because he was frightened by the fate of Copernicus himself, a man laughed at and dismissed by the crowd. He would keep that silence for another 13 years. Whatever we might wish he had done, feel the weight of the choice from the inside for a moment. A career rebuilt from nothing, a family living on his salary, a conviction he could prove to no one. He chose to wait for evidence. Life in Padua was not only work, and this is the part of the story where the man comes closest to us. In Venice, where he travelled often, he met a woman named Marina Gamba. She was young. She was not of his social class, and by every surviving indication the bond between them was real and lasting. They never married. A professor's position and the social rules of the age stood in the way, and it is more honest to say that plainly than to romanticize it. But Marina came to live near him in Padua, and between 1600 and 1606 they had 3 children, a daughter named Virginia, a second daughter named Livia, a son named Vincenzo, carrying the grandfather's name. Remember Virginia especially. She was born in the summer of 1600, in the middle of her father's happiest years. She would grow up quick and warm and observant, the child most like him. And near the end of this story, when her father is old and defeated and under guard on a quiet hillside, she will matter more than anyone else alive. Around the family stood a second circle of friends, and 2 names in it should be spoken slowly. The first was Giovan Francesco Sagredo, a Venetian nobleman, wealthy, curious, generous, who treated Galileo less like a client and more like a brother. The second was Filippo Salviati, a Florentine gentleman of the same spirit. Keep those 2 names somewhere safe. Sagredo and Salviati. 40 years from now, when an old man sits down to write the book that will bring the Inquisition to his door, he will name its speakers after these 2 dead friends, and in its pages they will go on talking together forever. These were the years Galileo later called the best of his life, and you can hear why. The mind was free. The pendulum studies deepened. The inclined plane experiments we spoke of, the bronze balls and the wooden channels and the weighed water were carried out and refined here. In Padua, mostly between about 1603 and 1608, filling those notebooks with measured numbers, the house was loud with students, children, instruments, and argument. In the evenings, sometimes, there was the lute. He was respected, settled, and, by 1609, 45 years old, a man, by the standards of the age, already looking at the far side of a career. Then, in the summer of 1609, while visiting Venice, he heard a rumour from the north. Somewhere in Holland, a spectacle maker had put 2 lenses in a tube, and the tube made distant things look near. Most people who heard that rumour were mildly amused, the way we are amused by news of a clever gadget. One man heard it and could not sleep. The rumour was true, and it had a paper trail. In October of 1608, a spectacle maker in the Dutch town of Middelburg, named Hans Lippershey, applied to the government of the Netherlands for a patent on what the documents called an instrument for seeing far. The patent was refused, and the reason tells you everything. Within weeks, other men were claiming the same invention, and the officials concluded that a device made of 2 ordinary lenses in a tube was too simple to be owned by anyone. They were right. The idea travelled faster than any patent could. By the spring of 1609, little spyglasses were being sold by opticians in Paris, and peddlers carried them across Europe as curiosities. They magnified about 3 times. They made a distant church tower look like a church tower 3 times closer. That was the whole trick. And to almost everyone, that was all it was. A toy for merchants, a novelty for fairs. Galileo heard about the Dutch tube in Venice in July of 1609, and his own published account tells us what happened next. Confirmation came in a letter from Paris, from a former student named Jacques Baudouin, verifying the device was real. Then Galileo went home to Padua and did the thing that separates this chapter from every other telling of the telescope story. He did not simply copy the instrument. He reasoned his way into it. He later wrote that he worked out the principle through the science of refraction, testing combinations of lenses. A convex lens at the front, a concave lens at the eye. His first tube magnified about 3 times. Matching the Dutch toy, most people would have stopped there, satisfied to have caught up. Galileo understood what the fairground peddlers did not. The power of the device was not fixed. It lived in the lenses, and lenses could be improved. He taught himself to grind and polish glass in his own workshop, the same ground floor where brass compasses had been made for a decade. The craftsman's hands, trained by 20 years of instrument making, took over. By late August, he had an instrument of roughly 8 or 9 powers, 3 times stronger than anything else in Europe. What he did with it next shows the other side of the man, the side that had been navigating patrons and salaries his whole adult life. He did not point it at the sky. He carried it up a bell tower in Venice and pointed it at the sea. Picture the scene, which survives in Venetian records and in Galileo's own letters from August of 1609. A procession of Venetian senators, the rulers of a maritime republic, climbing the stairs of the campanile of San Marco in their robes, taking turns at the eyepiece, and seeing ships at sea a full 2 hours before the sharpest watchman could see them with the naked eye. Venice lived and died by ships. 2 hours of warning about an approaching sail, friendly or hostile, was not a curiosity. It was naval intelligence. Days later, Galileo presented a telescope to the Doge as a gift, and the Senate answered by confirming his professorship for life and raising his salary to 1,000 florins a year. From 4 centuries away, it is easy to smile at the showmanship. It is wiser to see the lesson inside it. Galileo took the same object Europe had filed under toys and asked a different question about it. Not, what is this thing? But, what could this thing become? And who needs what it can do? The lenses in the Dutch tube and the lenses in Galileo's tube obeyed the same optics. The difference was the mind behind the eyepiece, a mind trained by a lute maker to distrust the obvious, sharpened on Archimedes, financed by brass instruments, and standing ready, by pure accident of biography. At the exact moment, history slid a piece of glass across the table. Through the autumn of 1609, he kept grinding, kept improving, pushing the magnification toward 20 powers, an instrument no one else on earth possessed, and at some point in those months, in what stands as one of the most consequential turns in the history of science, he stopped pointing the tube at ships and towers, and lifted it toward the night. The first thing he looked at was the moon. Every educated person in Europe knew what he was supposed to see. The philosophy taught in every university, the philosophy Galileo himself was paid to teach, held that the heavens were made of a different substance than the earth, perfect, unchanging, and smooth. The moon was a flawless, polished sphere. Its visible markings were explained away as differences in density, or reflections, anything but what they might actually be, through 20 powers of magnification. In November of 1609, Galileo watched the line between lunar day and lunar night, and saw that it was not a clean curve. It was ragged. Points of light stood inside the dark zone, and pools of shadow lingered inside the bright zone, and the points of light widened and joined as the sun rose over them, exactly the way sunrise catches mountain peaks before it reaches the valleys below. And because he was a mathematician holding a craftsman's instrument, he did what no one before him could have done. He measured the shadows, applied geometry, and calculated the height of mountains on the moon. Some of them, by his estimate, 4 miles high. Let the meaning settle the way it must have settled over him. Alone, in the cold of those November nights, the moon was a world, a place with mountains and plains, sunrise and shadow, a landscape like the earth. 20 centuries of philosophy said the heavens were made of perfection. His eyes said the heavens were made of rock. He kept looking. He turned the tube toward the stars, and found that wherever the old charts showed 1 star, the glass showed 10, 20, 50 more behind it. Crowds of stars no human eye had ever counted. He swept it across the pale band of the Milky Way, which the philosophers had explained as a kind of glowing vapour, and the vapour dissolved into stars, uncountable stars, all the way down. And then, on the 7th of January, 1610, he pointed the telescope at Jupiter, and saw 3 small bright points strung in a line beside the planet. We stood at this window together once before, in the first minutes of tonight's story. Now we know everything he knew as he stood there. The debts, the hidden letter to Kepler, the 13 years of silence, waiting for proof. On the 8th of January, the 3 points had shifted to the other side of the planet. Within days there were 4, and they moved night after night, never leaving Jupiter, swinging around it like dancers around a fire. They were moons. Jupiter had moons of its own, and if moons could circle Jupiter while Jupiter itself travelled the sky, then the oldest argument against Copernicus, that a moving Earth would leave its own moon behind, had just quietly died in a professor's window in Padua. Galileo understood, perhaps that very week, that he was no longer holding a naval instrument. He was holding evidence. The question now was what a careful man, a man who had kept silent for 13 years out of fear of laughter, would dare to do with it. He decided to publish. Fast. Speed, in the world of 1610, was not a natural advantage of science. Books took years to write and months to print. Scholars polished their arguments for decades. Galileo, who had sat on his convictions for 13 careful years, now moved like a man who had heard a starting gun. He had good reason. The telescope could not be kept secret. The Dutch tubes were spreading across Europe, and every month that passed raised the chance that some other pair of eyes, in Prague or Paris or London, would find the moons of Jupiter first. In the world of discovery, then as now, there is no prize for second. Through January and February of 1610, Galileo observed by night and wrote by day, sending pages to the printer in Venice, while the ink of his observations was barely dry. The book went on sale in March. 16 den, barely 2 months after the first sighting. He wrote it in Latin, the shared language of scholarship, because this message was not for Padua. It was for the world. He called it Siderius Nuncius, the Starry Messenger. It is a small book, some 60 pages, and part of its genius is that it does not argue. It reports. Here is what the instrument is. Here is the moon, night by night, with engravings made from my own drawings, the mountains catching sunrise, the shadows shrinking as the light climbs. Here are the stars behind the stars, the Milky Way resolved into countless suns, and here, dated like entries in a ship's log, are the 4 points of light that circle Jupiter, their positions recorded night after night, so that any reader with a good enough telescope can check for himself. That last gesture is the revolution hiding inside the book. Do not take my word. Look. The first printing sold out almost immediately. Within weeks, the book was being discussed in courts and universities across Europe, and within a few years, according to the correspondence of Jesuit missionaries, word of its discoveries had travelled with them as far as China. The English ambassador in Venice, Sir Henry Wotton, sent a copy home the very day it appeared, writing to London that the professor at Padua had either become famous forever or ridiculous forever, and that he could not yet tell which. Wotton had put his finger on the true situation. Fame arrived instantly. Belief did not, and the resistance was not simple stubbornness. Consider what was being asked. A man announces that the settled architecture of the heavens is wrong, and the evidence is visible only through a strange new instrument that he himself built, that almost no one else possesses, and that even in skilled hands showed a narrow, trembling circle of sky. Some philosophers refused to look through it at all, reasoning that if Aristotle was right, the instrument must be deceiving, so why look? Others looked and saw nothing, because early telescopes were genuinely difficult to use. An astronomer named Martin Hawkey published a pamphlet declaring the new stars an illusion of the glass. Pause, and be fair to the doubters for one breath, because their standard, extraordinary claims require verification, was the right standard. It was about to be met. The verification that mattered came from 2 directions. In Prague, Johannes Kepler, the imperial mathematician and the most respected astronomical mind in Europe, endorsed the discoveries in an open letter within weeks. On the strength of Galileo's reasoning, and later confirmed the moons himself when a good telescope reached him, and in Rome, the mathematicians of the Jesuit order, the intellectual elite of the Catholic Church, trained their own instruments on Jupiter, and in time formally confirmed the observations. The moons were real, the mountains were real, the crowds of new stars were real, but inside the starry messenger, alongside the science, Galileo had planted a seed of another kind, and it shows where his mind was already travelling. He named the 4 moons of Jupiter the Medicean stars, after Cosimo II de' Medici, the young Grand Duke of Tuscany, who had once been his summer pupil. It was, perhaps, the most valuable naming gift of its age. Kings collected jewels and palaces. No ruler on earth had his family's name written on the sky. Galileo dedicated the book to Cosimo, sent him the very telescope through which the moons had been found, and let the machinery of patronage do the rest. The machinery worked. In the summer of 1610, the court of Tuscany offered Galileo the post of chief mathematician and philosopher to the Grand Duke, with a salary of 1,000 scudi, no teaching duties at all, and, written into the title itself, a word Galileo had specifically negotiated, philosopher, mathematicians measured. Philosophers explained what the world was. He wanted, in ink, the authority to interpret his own discoveries. His Venetian friends were dismayed, and one of them, his beloved Sagredo, wrote him a letter that history has kept, because it reads today like prophecy. In the Republic of Venice, Sagredo reminded him Galileo had freedom and the protection of a state that bowed to no one. In Florence, he would be a courtier, safe only as long as the prince lived and the prince's favour lasted. And Florence, unlike Venice, lay well within the reach of Rome. Who can say? Sagredo asked in essence, where the shifting winds of a court will carry you, and who will shelter you there when the weather turns? Galileo went anyway. In September of 1610 he left Padua, left the republic that had sheltered him for 18 years, left Marina Gamba, who remained in Venice and later married another man. An arrangement settled, by all evidence, without bitterness, and took his daughters toward Florence. Virginia was 10 years old that autumn, riding south toward a new life beside a father whose name was suddenly known across Europe. He was going home to Tuscany, to glory, to the patronage of a duke whose family name now circled Jupiter. Sagredo's letter went with him, unanswered in the only way that mattered. 23 years would pass before its full price came due, but the sky, as if to reassure him, kept paying dividends, because through that autumn and winter, from his new home in Florence, Galileo aimed the telescope at the planet of love, and Venus began, slowly, month by month, to change shape. Florence received its famous son with everything a court knows how to give: a house, a salary, an invitation, banquets where the Grand Duke displayed his philosopher the way other princes displayed paintings. Galileo was 46, the most celebrated natural philosopher in Europe, and for the first time since his father's death, he was free of the classroom. He could simply think. What he did with the freedom, first, was complete the most beautiful proof of his life. The theory of Copernicus, the sun at the centre, the earth in motion, had always carried a hidden prediction that no naked eye could test. If Venus circles the sun inside the earth's own orbit, then Venus must show phases like the moon, a full face when it stands on the far side of the sun, a thin crescent when it swings near the earth, every shape between. In the old Ptolemaic system, with Venus circling a point between the earth and the sun, a full Venus was impossible. Here, for once, the two pictures of the universe disagreed about something visible. One of them had to fail. Beginning in the autumn of 1610, Galileo watched Venus night after night as it slowly ran through exactly the sequence Copernicus required, small and round and full on the far side of its journey, growing larger and thinner as it came around, a great luminous crescent at its nearest. In December he announced the result to his correspondents, first wrapped inside an anagram, a scrambled Latin sentence, which was the 17th century scientist's way of claiming a discovery before publishing it, and then openly. "The mother of loves," he wrote, "imitates the shapes of the moon. Follow what this meant, because it is the quiet summit of everything since the lamp in the cathedral." The mountains of the moon had shown that the heavens were made of ordinary matter. The moons of Jupiter had shown that not everything circles the earth. But the phases of Venus did something harder. They eliminated the pure system of Ptolemy, the architecture taught in the universities of Europe for centuries, could not produce a full Venus, and there the full Venus hung, in the eyepiece. For anyone who looked, the old sky did not merely become less likely that winter, it became impossible. Saturn, meanwhile, offered him a lesson in humility that he had the honesty to write down. Through his telescope the planet appeared not as one body, but three, a large globe with two smaller companions fixed at its sides. Then, across the following seasons, the companions shrank and vanished, and Galileo confessed his bewilderment on paper, wondering whether the instrument had mocked him. It had not. He was seeing the rings of Saturn, edge on and then tilted, through a glass too weak to resolve them, and the true answer would wait half a century for Christian Huygens and better lenses. Keep this episode on the shelf beside the triumphs, because it shows the method working even in failure. He reported what he saw, admitted what he could not explain, and left the mystery for stronger instruments, which is exactly what an honest science does with a mystery. Then he turned the telescope toward the sun itself, and toward trouble, observed near sunrise and sunset, and later projected safely onto paper through the telescope. The face of the sun showed dark blemishes, spots that drifted across the disk, changed shape, dissolved, and formed again. Sunspots had been glimpsed by naked eye observers for centuries, especially in Chinese records. Now they could be studied, and the study raised a dangerous question, because the sun, in the old philosophy, was the purest object in the heavens, and here it was, blemished and changing. The question found its opponent, a learned Jesuit astronomer in Germany, Christoph Scheiner, publishing cautiously under a pen name, proposed that the spots were not on the sun at all, but were swarms of small planets crossing in front of it, a theory that protected the sun's perfection. Galileo answered in a series of letters published in Rome in 1613, and he did not merely disagree. He demonstrated, using the geometry of how the spots foreshortened near the sun's edges, he proved they lay on, or almost on, the solar surface, and that their motion revealed the sun rotating on its axis, turning once in about a month. The blemishes were real, the rotation was real, the perfection was finished. Those letters on sunspots became a landmark for one more reason. In their pages, for the first time in print, Galileo openly endorsed the system of Copernicus. The years of careful silence were over. The most famous scientist in Europe had publicly declared that the earth moves. That same year, 1613, a quieter decision was made in the Galilei household, and it deserves its place here. Between the triumphs, Galileo's daughters, Virginia and Livia, born outside marriage, faced narrow prospects in Florentine society, and their father, short of money and consumed by his work, placed them in the convent of San Matteo in Arcetri, in the hills just south of the city. Virginia was 13. In time, she would take vows and choose a new name. Sister Maria Celeste. Celeste for the heavens her father had opened. Hold her name in mind through the storms that are coming. While the great world argues about the sun, a girl behind convent walls will be learning to write letters, and those letters, more than 100 of them, will one day carry this story's warmest light. And now the story begins to darken, not with a villain, but with something more human and more instructive. Galileo won his arguments too well. His letters and books did not just defeat opposing ideas, they made the men who held them look foolish. In sparkling Italian prose that educated Italy read aloud for pleasure, Scheiner, whose claim to the sunspots became a bitter dispute over priority, never forgave him, and Scheiner had brothers of his order in every court in Europe. The philosophers whose careers rested on Aristotle watched their foundations being auctioned off in public, and began, quietly, to look for a different battlefield, one where telescopes counted for less. They found it. If the new astronomy could not be beaten with evidence, perhaps it could be beaten with scripture. In December of 1613, the challenge surfaced, politely, at the Grand Duke's own breakfast table. Galileo was not present. His friend and former student, Benedetto Castelli, a Benedictine monk and professor of mathematics, was, and the Grand Duchess Christina, the pious and formidable grandmother of the young Duke, pressed Castelli with the question that would shadow the next 20 years. Scripture says the sun moves. Joshua commanded the sun to stand still, and it stood. How can the earth move, if the Bible says otherwise? Castelli defended the science ably and reported the conversation in a letter to Florence. Galileo read it, and instead of letting the matter rest at a breakfast table, he sat down and wrote a reply that grew into one of the most consequential documents of the century, his letter to Castelli, later expanded into the letter to the Grand Duchess Christina. In it, he argued that the Bible speaks the everyday language of the people it was written for, while nature speaks mathematics, and that since both come from the same author, they cannot truly conflict. When they seem to, it is the human interpretation of Scripture, not the demonstration of nature, that must be re-examined. And he sharpened the point by borrowing a saying he attributed to Cardinal Cesare Baronio, that the intention of Scripture is to teach us how one goes to heaven, not how the heavens go. As theology, later centuries would largely come to agree with him. As strategy, in the Italy of 1614, it was gasoline. Copies of the letter circulated, and copies of copies, some altered by his enemies to sharpen the offence. A Dominican friar denounced him from a Florentine pulpit. Another filed a complaint with the Inquisition in Rome. The mathematician had stepped, in writing, onto the territory of the theologians. In a decade when the Church, still at war with the Protestant Reformation, guarded that territory with tribunals. Sagredo's warning was 4 years old now, and coming true on schedule. There was no republic around Galileo anymore. There was a court, a pulpit, and a road to Rome. And Galileo, being Galileo, decided that the answer to the gathering storm was to travel to Rome in person and win the argument face to face. He believed, as he had believed since the lamp and the lute strings. That evidence, clearly presented, must, in the end, persuade. Rome was about to teach him what institutions do when they are handed evidence they have decided not to see. Galileo arrived in Rome in December of 1615, against the advice of nearly everyone who loved him. The Tuscan ambassador, who would have to host him, wrote back to Florence in something close to alarm, warning that this was a dangerous season to argue about the heavens in Rome, and that Galileo was walking into a fire of his own free will. The Grand Duke let him go anyway, and provided a litter for the journey and rooms at the Tuscan embassy, the Villa Medici. Galileo was 51 years old, increasingly troubled by arthritis, and utterly certain of the one belief that had never failed him in a lecture hall, that a clear argument, honestly presented, wins. Picture him in those first Roman weeks, because for a little while the city seemed to prove him right. Winter light on the palaces, fires burning in the great reception rooms of the cardinals, and in the middle of it all, the visitor from Florence, holding court in gardens and drawing rooms, patient with every question, devastating in every exchange. Guests wrote letters home describing evenings where Galileo would first present his opponent's arguments better than the opponents themselves could manage, and then, gently, take them apart piece by piece. One churchman, Monsignor Querengo, wrote with open amusement that watching him dispute was like watching a man fence against 30 opponents at once and disarm them all. But the audience that mattered was not in the gardens. Inside the Holy Office, the machinery of the Inquisition had been quietly weighing the Copernican question for months, pushed along by the complaints filed from Florence, and at the centre of that machinery stood Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, 73 years old, a Jesuit, the most authoritative theologian in the Catholic Church, personally austere, universally respected, and carrying a piece of history that everyone in Rome remembered. 16 years earlier, Bellarmine had been among the inquisitors in the case of Giordano Bruno, the former friar who had preached an infinite universe of countless suns, refused to recant a list of theological charges, and been burned at the stake in the Campo de' Fiori in the year 1600. Let this story be honest where many tellings are not. Bruno was not executed for Copernican astronomy. His condemnation rested on theological charges, and he was not a scientist in any meaningful sense. But his death hung over Rome as a demonstration of where defiance could end, and everyone negotiating with the Holy Office in 1616, Galileo included, negotiated in its shadow. Bellarmine's actual position deserves care, because it was subtler than the cartoon version. In a letter of April 1615 to a Carmelite friar named Paolo Foscarini, who had published a defence of Copernicus, Bellarmine set out his view in writing. If there were a true demonstration that the earth circles the sun, he wrote, then the Church would have to proceed with great care in explaining the scriptures that seem to say otherwise, and admit that we had not understood them. But, he continued, he did not believe such a demonstration existed, until it did. The safe course was to treat Copernicus as a useful calculating device, a supposition, not a truth about the world. And here is the quiet tragedy of 1616, worth turning over slowly in the dark. Bellarmine's standard, "Show me the proof, and the Church will reconsider," was not unreasonable on its face, and Galileo's evidence, the moons, the phases of Venus, the sunspots, had wrecked the old Ptolemaic system beyond repair. But wrecking Ptolemy was not the same as proving Copernicus. A third system existed, designed by the Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe, in which the planets circle the sun, while the sun circles a motionless earth, and Tycho's arrangement matched every observation Galileo's telescope had yet made. The proof Bellarmine demanded, direct evidence of the earth's own motion, was genuinely not in anyone's hands. Galileo believed he had it. In his theory that the tides were caused by the earth's double motion, he was wrong. The tides are governed chiefly by the moon. The one argument he trusted most was the one argument that failed. He would carry that flawed proof, unknowing, for the rest of his life, like a sword with a hidden crack. While Galileo charmed the drawing rooms, the process moved. In February of 1616, a panel of theological consultants delivered their assessment of two propositions drawn from Copernicus, that the sun is the immobile centre of the world. They judged foolish and absurd in philosophy, and formally heretical. That the earth moves, they judged to merit the same censure in philosophy, and to be at least erroneous in faith. The assessment was a working opinion, not a formal papal decree, but it set the direction. The Pope, Paul V, instructed Bellarmine to summon Galileo and deliver a warning. On the 26th of February, 1616, Galileo came to Bellarmine's residence. What exactly happened in that room would decide his fate 17 years later, and the honest answer is that the record is disputed. Two versions survive in the files of the Holy Office. By one account, Bellarmine courteously conveyed the warning that the Copernican opinion could not be defended or held as truth. A second document in the same file, unsigned by Galileo and irregular in its form, records something harsher, an injunction forbidding him to hold, teach, or defend the opinion in any way whatsoever. In speech or in writing, historians have argued for a century over that second page, some suspecting it was drafted improperly at the time. Hold it in your mind like a splinter. It will surface again, at the worst possible moment of this life. What Galileo himself took away is documented, because rumours immediately ran through Rome that he had been forced to formally recant, and he asked Bellarmine for a certificate stating the truth. Bellarmine provided it, in writing, in May. Galileo, the certificate said, had neither abjured nor been punished. He had simply been notified that the Copernican doctrine could not be defended or held. Galileo kept that paper for the rest of his life. The way a traveller keeps a receipt he suspects he will one day need. In March, the Congregation of the Index acted publicly, suspending the Book of Copernicus itself until corrected, and banning Foscarini's defence outright. Copernicanism, as a physical truth, was now forbidden ground for every Catholic in the world. Galileo's own name appeared nowhere in the decree, and to outward eyes he returned to Florence unmarked, even honoured, having been received by the Pope himself in a friendly audience. But weigh what he actually carried home in the spring of 1616. The conclusion he knew to be true was now off limits. The proof he needed did not yet exist. His strongest weapon, the tide argument, was cracked at the core, and he could not see the crack. And in a file in Rome sat an unsigned page, whose exact words he may never have fully known. He went quiet for 7 years. He turned to other work, and to a quarrel about comets that we are about to witness, in the hills south of Florence. Meanwhile, a young nun named Maria Celeste was growing into the correspondent whose letters would one day hold her father's world together, and Galileo waited, as he had waited once before, for the weather to change. In the summer of 1623, the weather changed. The reigning pope died, and the cardinals elected in his place a Florentine intellectual, a man who wrote poetry, admired the new science, and had once, after a dinner debate, composed verses in Galileo's honour. Maffeo Barberini took the name Urban VIII. In Florence, the old scientist read the news and allowed himself, for the first time in 7 years, to hope his friend was on the throne of St. Peter. To understand the hope of 1623, and why it proved so costly, we have to step back 3 years, to the affair that made Galileo the most dazzling and most resented writer in Italy. It began, of all places, with comets. In the autumn of 1618, 3 comets appeared over Europe in succession, the third bright enough to be seen in daylight, and all of educated Europe argued about what they were. At the Jesuit Roman College, the mathematician Orazio Grassi delivered and published a lecture arguing, sensibly enough by the evidence of the day, that comets were real celestial bodies travelling beyond the moon. Galileo, confined to bed through much of that winter by illness, had barely observed the comets at all, but he was persuaded that Grassi's reasoning was sloppy, and through a discourse published under the name of his disciple Mario Guiducci, he attacked it, proposing instead that comets might be optical phenomena, sunlight refracted through vapours risen from the earth. Pause on the irony, because this story owes you honesty above loyalty to its hero. On the substance, the Jesuit stood closer to the truth. Comets are indeed bodies beyond the moon, and the vapour theory was wrong. The greatest observational astronomer alive got the comets wrong, partly because he had been too sick to observe them. Brilliance is not a vaccine against error, and the moment a thinker forgets that, brilliance itself becomes a liability. Grassi answered under a pen name, Lotario Sarsi, with a book that pointedly needled Galileo, and Galileo, stung, spent 3 years shaping his reply, which appeared in Rome in October of 1623, under the title Il Saggiatore, the assayer, the name of the delicate scale used for weighing gold. The title itself was the first insult. His opponent, it implied, weighed arguments with a crude steelyard. Galileo would weigh them to the grain. The assayer is, by wide agreement, one of the most brilliant pieces of polemical prose ever written in Italian, and one of the founding documents of the scientific method. Besides, in its most famous passage, Galileo wrote that philosophy is written in the grand book of the universe, which stands continually open before our eyes, but that the book cannot be understood unless one first learns the language in which it is written. It is written in the language of mathematics, he said, and its characters are triangles, circles, and geometric figures, without which one wanders in a dark labyrinth. 4 centuries later, working physicists still describe their craft in almost exactly those terms. The book carried a subtler idea too, one that reached far beyond comets. Galileo distinguished between the properties that belong to bodies themselves: shape, size, motion, number, and the qualities that exist only in the observer: taste, odor, color, warmth. Tickle a statue's foot and nothing happens. He observed, because the tickling is not in the feather, it is in us. Philosophers would later call these primary and secondary qualities, and the distinction would echo through European thought from Descartes to Locke and beyond. Rome devoured the book. The new Pope, Urban VIII, elected that very autumn, was reported in contemporary accounts to have had the Esseia read aloud to him at table, laughing with pleasure at its wit. Imagine that dining room for a moment. Candlelight, a reader's voice, the most powerful man in the Catholic world, laughing at sentences written by his old Florentine acquaintance. It is the warmest scene in this half of the story, and it is precisely where triumph began, quietly converting itself into ruin, through 2 doors at once. The first door was the Jesuits. Grassi was not defeated by the Esseia. He was humiliated by it. In prose, all of Italy was quoting at dinner. The Society of Jesus had verified Galileo's discoveries in 1611, honoured him at the Roman College, defended him as a genius. The sunspot quarrel with China had strained the friendship. The Esseia ended it. An order with members in every court in Catholic Europe now contained at its scientific summit men with personal reasons to wish Galileo brought low, and the patience to wait. The second door was the Pope himself, and here the story asks for care, because the friendship was real. In the spring of 1624, Galileo travelled to Rome to pay homage, and was received with extraordinary warmth. 6 audiences in 6 weeks, gifts, a pension arranged for his son, letters praising him to the Grand Duke, and in their conversations the 2 men circled the forbidden subject. By the accounts that survive, Urban was willing to permit a book that discussed the 2 rival systems of the world, Ptolemy against Copernicus, provided the discussion remained hypothetical, treating the Earth's motion as a supposition useful for calculation, never as established truth. And Urban had a personal argument he required such a book to contain, an argument he considered decisive. God is omnipotent. However well a theory explains the appearances, tides included, an all-powerful God could have produced the same appearances by countless means beyond human imagination. Therefore no man may claim to have demonstrated how the heavens must be built. To Urban this reasoning was a jewel of theology. Keep it beside the unsigned page from 1616, the second splinter. In 7 years it is going to be placed in the mouth of a character on the last page of a book, and it is going to help break the book's author. Galileo went home to Florence, carrying what he believed was a papal green light, and began the great work he had postponed since 1616. He was 60 years old, often ill, and he wrote slowly, through interruptions of health and through plague years that closed the roads of Italy. In those same years, the letters came and went between his villa and the convent down the road. Maria Celeste sending candied fruit and mended collars and steady encouragement. watching over his household from behind the grill, following the great book's slow progress, the way another daughter might follow a ship at sea. The manuscript grew for 6 years. He shaped it as a conversation across 4 days, in Italian rather than Latin, so that every literate Italian could follow, and he cast it with 3 speakers whose names you already know. Salviati, the Copernican, named for his dead Florentine friend, carrying Galileo's own arguments, Sagredo, the intelligent, open-minded layman, named for the beloved Venetian who had warned him about courts and princes, presiding as a kind of referee, and a third figure, the defender of Aristotle and Ptolemy, whom Galileo named Simplicio, officially after an ancient commentator on Aristotle, though every reader in Italy could hear the other meaning. The simpleton, even the naming, was a provocation. The content was the gamble. Day by day, the dialogue dismantled the physics of Aristotle, answered the classic objections to a moving earth, explained why we do not feel the motion, presented the sunspots and the phases of Venus, and built toward the 4th day, and Galileo's cherished, cracked proof from the tides. The hypothetical framing grew thinner with every page. No honest reader could finish the book in doubt about which side had won. He finished around 1630, then spent 2 years wrestling the manuscript through the machinery of church licensing, a tangle of negotiations between Rome and Florence, revised prefaces, and censors whose approval's history still argues about. In February of 1632, the book finally appeared in Florence. Dialogue concerning the 2 chief world systems. On its title page, as required, stood the official imprimatur, the Church's own printed permission. For a few months, letters of admiration poured in from across Europe. Then, in the summer of 1632, the letters from Rome changed tone. The Pope, correspondents warned, was in a fury. Sales of the book were ordered stopped. A special commission had been convened, and somewhere in the files of the Holy Office, a 16-year-old unsigned page had been found again. The friend on the throne of St. Peter was about to become the most dangerous enemy Galileo ever had. To understand the summer of 1632, you have to understand what 9 years of the papacy had done to Urban VIII. The poet, Pope of 1623, the man who had verses written in Galileo's honour, no longer existed. In his place sat a ruler under siege. Europe was deep in the 30 Years' War, a Catholic and Protestant slaughter redrawing the continent, and Urban's foreign policy, leaning toward France and away from Spain, had made him powerful enemies inside his own church. In March of 1632, at a formal meeting of cardinals, a Spanish cardinal stood up and accused the Pope, to his face, of tolerating heresy and failing to defend the faith. Urban was, by the accounts of that spring, shaken, suspicious, and acutely aware that he could not afford to look soft on doctrine. Into that atmosphere, that exact season, arrived a book from Florence, and the book, whatever its title page said about hypothetical discussion, read like a verdict. Every argument for the moving earth stood tall and shining. Every argument against it came from the mouth of a character named Simplicio, and Simplicio lost every exchange across 4 days. Then came the final page. As the dialogue closes, Simplicio offers one last reflection, that God in his infinite power, could have produced the tides by many means unimaginable to human minds, and that no one may confine divine power within the bounds of his own fancy. It was Urban's argument, the Pope's own cherished reasoning, the jewel he had personally required the book to contain, delivered by the character all Italy read as the simpleton. On the last page, where its placement made it sound like a pious formula pasted over a Copernican triumph, did Galileo intend the insult? 4 centuries of historians have argued it, and honesty requires saying the evidence for deliberate mockery is thin. He had known Urban for decades, and had every reason to keep his favour. The likeliest explanation is also the most human one. He had grown so used to winning arguments that he had lost the ability to imagine how his words landed in a proud and frightened reader. But intention did not matter. Urban was persuaded, and remained persuaded to the end of his life, that he had been made a fool of before Europe by a man he had protected. Courtiers reported him raging that Galileo had not feared to make sport of him. What followed moved with the speed of personal anger. Sales of the dialogue were halted. A commission examined how the book had ever been licensed. In the files of the Holy Office, the investigators found the unsigned memorandum of 1616, the splinter with its sweeping words, not to hold, teach, or defend in any way whatsoever. Galileo had negotiated the book's licensing for 2 years without ever mentioning such an injunction. Now the whole affair looked to Rome like deliberate deception, a banned doctrine smuggled past the censors under the Pope's own nose. The file went to the Inquisition, and in October of 1632 a summons went north. Galileo Galilei was ordered to present himself in Rome, before the Holy Office. Within 30 days, in Florence, the summons found a man of 68 who was genuinely failing. 3 physicians certified that he suffered from hernia, arthritis, vertigo, and melancholy, and that a winter journey might kill him. The reply from Rome carried the Pope's personal edge. He could come willingly, or he could be brought in chains. The Grand Duke, Ferdinando II, was 22 years old, devout, and unwilling to defy the papacy for his grandfather's old tutor. He provided a litter, his ambassador's hospitality, and nothing more. Sagredo's warning of 1610 had come due at last, and it bears hearing one more time across the years. In Venice, you were protected by a state. In Florence, you are protected by a person. Persons change. Princes bow to Rome. Down the road from the villa, behind the grill of San Matteo, Maria Celeste wrote to her father through those weeks with a steadiness the letters still carry, managing his household from a distance, sending remedies for his health, keeping fear out of her handwriting for his sake. He left Florence in January of 1633, crossed the plague quarantine lines in the cold, and reached Rome in February. He was lodged, by unusual courtesy, not in a cell, but at the Tuscan embassy, and for 2 months nothing happened. While the machinery prepared itself, and the old man waited, writing letters that swung between confidence and dread, he still believed, on the good days, that he could explain. He had Bellamine's certificate in his papers, the receipt he had kept for 17 years. What he did not yet understand was that the coming proceeding was not going to be a debate about astronomy at all. Nobody in that building was going to look through a telescope. The trial of Galileo would be about one question only: obedience. On the 12th of April, 1633, he was called at last to the palace of the Holy Office, and the doors closed behind him. The room was not a dungeon. That should be said plainly, because imagination supplies torches and racks, and the reality was a chamber with a table, a notary writing everything down, and a handful of officials in clerical dress. Galileo was housed during the proceedings in the apartments of a friendly official, his meals sent in from the Tuscan embassy. The violence of what followed was not physical, it was the slow, procedural crushing of a man by an institution that held every card and knew it. The record of the interrogations survives, and we can follow it almost word by word. At the first hearing, the questioning went straight to 16. 16. What had he been commanded, and by whom? Galileo produced Bellarmine's certificate, the paper saying only that he could not hold or defend the Copernican opinion. The inquisitors produced their unsigned memorandum, with its harsher words: not to hold, teach, or defend in any way whatsoever. Bellarmine was 12 years dead, and could not resolve the difference. Galileo said he did not remember any command beyond the certificate, and then, pressed about the dialogue, he made the decision historians have puzzled over ever since. He claimed his book did not defend Copernicus at all, that it actually showed the Copernican arguments to be weak and inconclusive. It was not true, and everyone in the room knew it was not true. 3 consultants, appointed by the Holy Office, read the dialogue and reported accurately that it taught and defended the moving earth on nearly every page. Perhaps Galileo was following bad legal advice to concede nothing. Perhaps a lifetime of winning arguments had convinced him he could win this one on a technicality. Whatever the reason, the strategy collapsed, and it handed the tribunal something worse than heresy. It handed them a defendant who appeared to be lying to the Inquisition. Behind the scenes, a churchman tried to save him. The Commissary General of the Holy Office, Vincenzo Maculano, met privately with Galileo in late April, and Maculano's own letter describing the meeting survives. He persuaded the old man that the evidence was overwhelming and that his only path was admission. At the next hearing, Galileo returned and offered a confession of a carefully limited kind. He had reread his own book, he said, after 3 years away from it, and found to his surprise that a reader unaware of his inner intention could indeed take it as a defence of Copernicus. His error, he said, had been one of vainglorious ambition, of taking too much pleasure in appearing clever, in making the weaker side seem strong. He offered to add a day to the dialogue, refuting the Copernican arguments. The offer was ignored. The book was beyond saving, and so, in the tribunal's eyes, was the distinction he was trying to keep between what he had written and what he believed. There was one more hearing, in June, and it must be described exactly because it is the source of a myth. The sentence required that Galileo be examined on his intention, and the formula for such an examination included the mention of torture. The threat could be spoken. The records show it was formal, that no torture was used, and that given his age and the customs of the court, it almost certainly was never going to be used. But he was made to hear the words. He answered that he did not hold the Copernican opinion, and had not held it since the command of 16, and that he was in their hands. They could do as they pleased. Whatever we make of those answers, it is not for any of us, 4 centuries safe, to call them cowardice. He was 69, alone, and standing where Bruno had stood, on the 22nd of June, 1633, in the great hall of the Dominican convent of Santa Maria sopra Minerva. Galileo was brought in wearing the white shirt of a penitent and made to kneel while the sentence was read. The dialogue was prohibited. Its author was declared vehemently suspect of heresy, a formal legal category 1 step below heretic, for having held and defended a doctrine contrary to Holy Scripture. He was condemned to formal imprisonment at the pleasure of the Inquisition, and to recite the 7 penitential psalms weekly for 3 years. Then a written abjuration was placed before him, and the man who had seen the mountains of the moon read it aloud on his knees. With sincere heart and unfeigned faith, the text ran, "I abjure, curse, and detest the said errors and heresies." He signed. Of the 10 cardinal inquisitors, 3, for reasons still debated, never put their names to the sentence. And now the legend, which this story owes you the honesty to weigh, the famous words, "Eppur si muove," and yet it moves, muttered in defiance as he rose from his knees. It is one of the most beloved sentences in the history of science, and the historical record cannot support it. It appears in no document of the trial, in no letter of anyone present, in nothing Galileo himself ever wrote. It surfaces in print more than a century after his death, and, though a painting from the 1640s bearing the phrase has been reported, suggesting the legend grew early among his admirers, no careful historian today presents the utterance as fact. To speak those words in that hall would have been close to suicide, and Galileo, whatever else he was not done living. But here is what the legend gets right, and why it refuses to die. The earth did still move. No signature on any parchment altered the orbits of the 4 moons, or the phases of Venus, or the numbers in the Padua notebooks. The abjuration bound one exhausted man. It could not bind the sky. People invented the whisper because they understood, correctly, that something in that hall remained unconquered, and they gave it a voice. The imprisonment was softened almost at once. He was released to the custody of the Archbishop of Siena, a friend who received him with honour and slowly talked him back from a despair that, by the Archbishop's own account, had approached real danger. And in December of 1633 the Inquisition permitted him to return to his own small villa at Arcetri, in the hills just south of Florence. On strict terms, he was not to leave, he was not to teach, he was not to receive gatherings of visitors. The sentence would last as long as he lived. The villa was called Il Gioiello, the jewel. Its windows looked out over olive trees toward a convent a short walk down the road, the convent of San Matteo, where a nun had been waiting through every week of the trial, reading every letter, carrying his penance already in her own voice. In the world, long ago in Padua, she had been called Virginia. Behind the grille she was Sister Maria Celeste, and in the darkest room of this story, she is the light that is coming. The villa at Arcetri stood among olive trees on a hillside south of Florence, and from its windows, on a clear day, you could see the dome of the cathedral in the valley below. Galileo had chosen the house years earlier, for one reason above all. It was a short walk from the convent where his daughters lived. They had been there since 1613, as we saw, placed behind those walls as girls because their birth outside marriage left them few paths in Florentine society. It remains one of the harder truths of this life, and it should be faced rather than softened. Livia, who became Sister Arcangela, seems to have struggled with illness and withdrawal all her days, and the record of her is thin and sad. But Virginia, who chose the name Maria Celeste, Celeste for the heavens her father had opened, grew into the person who understood him best. We know this not through legend, but through paper. 124 of her letters to her father survive, spanning the last decade of her life, and they were brought fully into the light for modern readers by the writer Dava Sobel, whose book Galileo's Daughter is built upon them. His letters back to her are lost, likely destroyed by the convent after the trial, when keeping the correspondence of a condemned man was dangerous. But her side of the conversation remains, and it is enough. In those pages she mends his shirts and candies his citrons, manages his household accounts from behind convent walls, begs him gently to take care of his health, teases him, worries for his soul, and follows every turn of his work and his troubles with an intelligence that leaps off the page. During the trial she wrote constantly, and when the sentence required the weekly psalms, Maria Celeste took the penance upon herself, telling him she had begun saying them on his behalf. When he finally came home to Arcetri in December of 1633, broken, humiliated, forbidden almost everything, she was the reason the hillside felt like refuge rather than prison. She had 4 months left to live. In the early spring of 1634, Maria Celeste fell ill with dysentery, and on the 2nd of April she died. She was 33 years old. Galileo's letters from the weeks that followed describe a grief that frightened his friends. He wrote that he heard her calling him, that an immense sadness had settled on him, that his pulse and his appetite had failed. He was 69, condemned, confined, and now bereft of the one person whose love had asked nothing of him. Most stories would end here, in the olive trees, with an old man waiting for the dark. What actually happened next is, by any fair measure, among the most astonishing recoveries in the history of the human mind. Sometime in the depths of that grief, Galileo went back to work, not on astronomy, which the sentence had made impossible, but on the work of his youth. The notebooks from Padua, the inclined planes and the pendulums, the mathematics of motion and of the strength of materials, the unfinished science he had set aside almost 30 years earlier when the telescope seized his life. Slowly, in the quiet of Arcetri, he built his last book, and he gave it the same form as the book that had destroyed him. 4 days of conversation among 3 friends named Salviati, Sagredo, and Simplicio, the dead friends of Venice and Florence, summoned one final time to talk. The book is known today as the Discourses on 2 New Sciences, and by the judgment of history it is his greatest scientific work. The dialogue of 1632 had argued about where the earth stands. The 2 new sciences quietly founded the physics by which everything stands. In its pages, the law of falling bodies receives its final form. Distance growing with the square of time. The path of a projectile is proven to be a parabola, a result that would guide gunners and engineers for 3 centuries. The pendulum, the braking strength of beams, the resistance of materials, even early glimpses of the mathematics of infinity, all of it laid out in the calm voices of 3 friends who no longer needed to fight about the heavens. There remained the problem of printing it, because the Inquisition had forbidden publication of any book by Galileo. Old or new, the solution travelled the trade routes of Europe. A Dutch publisher named Louis Elsevier visited Italy. The manuscript passed into his hands, and the book appeared in Leiden, in Protestant Holland, in 1638. Beyond the reach of Rome, Galileo, protecting himself with a thin and knowing irony, wrote in the dedication that he was astonished to learn his pages had found their way to a printer abroad. No one was fooled. No one moved against him. The book crossed Europe and became a foundation stone. When Isaac Newton later wrote that he had seen further by standing on the shoulders of giants, the first of those shoulders belonged to the old man of Arcetri, blind. By then, through 1637, his right eye failed, then his left, and by the beginning of 1638, the man who had seen the mountains of the moon, the moons of Jupiter, and the phases of Venus before any other human being, could no longer see a candle held before his face. He wrote about it in a letter that is difficult to read without pausing. This universe, he said, which he had enlarged 100 and 1,000 times beyond what the wise men of past ages had believed, was now for him shrunk to the narrow space of his own body. Even then, he did not stop. The Inquisition, told of his blindness, relaxed the confinement slightly, allowing visitors and care. Students came to live with him and serve as his eyes and hands. First the young Vincenzo Viviani, whose adoring biography we have weighed so carefully throughout this story, and near the end, Evangelista Torricelli, who would go on to invent the barometer. Scholars travelled from across Europe to sit with the famous prisoner. Among them, in 1638, came a young Englishman on his continental tour, a poet named John Milton, who recorded the visit himself years later in Areopagitica, his great plea for the freedom of the press, remembering the old man grown blind, a prisoner of the Inquisition for thinking in astronomy otherwise than his senses thought. Milton carried that image into Paradise Lost, where the Tuscan artist and his optic glass appear among the stars of the epic, and into the long argument for free thought that runs from his century into ours. And in 1641, in the last full year of his life, the blind man solved one more problem. He had proven in Padua that the pendulum keeps steady time. Now, dictating to his son Vincenzo, he described how a swinging pendulum could be linked to the gears of a clock, regulating its motion, and drawings were made from his instructions. He did not live to see it built. Christian Huygens constructed the first working pendulum clock in 1657, and timekeeping, navigation, and science itself were transformed. If we allow the old story of the cathedral its poetry, the idea had begun with a boy counting his pulse beneath a swinging lamp. It ended with a blind old man counting in the dark, giving the world the means to measure time more truly than any civilization before it. On the 8th of January, 1642, with Viviani and Torricelli beside his bed, Galileo Galilei died at Arcetri. He was 77 years old. He died a condemned man, under sentence, denied, even in death, the honours of his rank. The Grand Duke wished to build him a grand tomb in the Basilica of Santa Croce in Florence, facing Michelangelo. Rome objected. The plan was dropped. The body was placed in a small side room off a chapel, almost hidden, and there it waited. It waited 95 years. In 1737, a new generation moved him at last into the great monument in Santa Croce that visitors stand before today. Across the nave from Michelangelo, the two Florentines facing each other down the centuries, and when the tomb was opened for the reburial, admirers removed, as relics, 3 fingers from his right hand, one of them, the middle finger of the hand that wrote the Starry Messenger, stands upright in a glass case in the Galileo Museum in Florence to this day, pointing, depending on your mood, toward heaven, or toward everyone who ever told him to be silent. The story of the man was over. The story of what he set in motion was barely beginning. In the winter, Galileo died, by the calendar then used in England. A child was born in a farmhouse in Lincolnshire, and the child was Isaac Newton. The neatness of that timing has charmed writers for centuries, and honesty asks for a footnote. By the reformed calendar we use today, Newton's birth falls in the first days of 1643, but the poetic accounting is truer than it looks, because the work passed directly from one pair of hands to the other. Newton inherited 3 streams and joined them. From Galileo came the mathematics of motion on Earth, the falling bodies, the parabolas, the principle that a body in motion continues unless something acts upon it. From Johannes Kepler came the true laws of the planets, their elliptical paths around the sun. In 1687, in the Principia Mathematica, Newton showed that these were not 2 sciences, but one. The force pulling Galileo's bronze balls down their wooden ramps was the same force holding Jupiter's moons in their orbits. Universal gravitation, the book of the universe, written in the language of mathematics, exactly as the assayer had promised. And now, at last, readable. Notice what had quietly happened to the great question. Within a generation or 2 of the trial, working astronomers everywhere, including many inside the church, treated the motion of the earth as settled. The Inquisition had won its case and lost the world. The machinery of censorship retreated step by step, in a slow tide that tells its own story. In 1757, books teaching the earth's motion were quietly permitted. In 1822, the Holy Office allowed such books to be printed in Rome itself. In 1835, the Dialogue came off the Index of Forbidden Books at last, 2 centuries after its author knelt in the white shirt of a penitent, and the institution itself, to its credit, eventually turned and faced the memory. In 1979, Pope John Paul II called for a fresh examination of the case, and in 1992, receiving the report of the commission he had appointed, he acknowledged before the Pontifical Academy of Sciences that the theologians of Galileo's day had erred, that they had confused a question of physical science with a question of faith, and that Galileo, in his reading of Scripture, had seen more clearly than his judges. 359 years had passed since the sentence. It is easy to mock the slowness. It is perhaps more useful to notice how rarely any institution of any kind in all of history has formally examined its own worst verdict and published the finding against itself. Science, meanwhile, kept writing Galileo's name on its instruments. When the American Space Agency sent a spacecraft to Jupiter, launched in 1989, to spend years circling the planet and studying the 4 moons of January 1610, the mission was called Galileo. Count what those 4 points of light became. Io with its volcanoes, Europa with an ocean beneath its ice that stands today among the most promising places to seek life beyond the earth. The specks in a Paduan window became destinations. And when Europe built its own satellite navigation system, the constellation that now tells millions of phones where they are, it named the system Galileo. So there is a fair chance the old man's name has helped guide you home. Albert Einstein, introducing a translation of the dialogue called Galileo, the father of modern physics, indeed of modern science altogether, because his discovery and use of the method of proof, the marriage of experiment and mathematics, was the true beginning. These are large words from a careful man, and what they honour is not any single discovery. Others would have found the moons of Jupiter within a few years. The telescopes were spreading. The sky was waiting. What might not have arrived for a long time was the method and the temperament behind it, the willingness to let a measurement overrule a philosopher, the insistence that authority, however ancient, however sacred, however beloved, must answer to evidence. That insistence did not stay inside science. It travelled into courtrooms, where verdicts came to demand proof, into medicine, where treatments came to demand trials, into the habits of every citizen who has ever asked a confident official, "How do you know that?" The trial of Galileo never really ended, because it was never only about one man and one book. It restages itself in every generation. Wherever comfortable certainty meets inconvenient evidence, and each of us, whether we notice or not, is standing somewhere in that room. Some days we are the man with the telescope, other days, and this is the harder honesty, we are the professors who refused to look, because we already know what we would rather see. Galileo was not a saint, and this story has not tried to make him one. He was vain, sarcastic, and reckless with the pride of powerful men. He abandoned no principle, but he signed the abjuration. He placed his daughters behind convent walls and was repaid with a love he had not entirely earned. He was wrong about the comets, wrong about the tides, and too proud to suspect it. He was, in short, a human being, and that is precisely the point of him. The heavens were not opened by a flawless marble figure. They were opened by a musician's son with debts, grudges, aching joints, and one unbreakable habit, the habit his father taught him with lute strings and hanging weights in a crowded house in Pisa. When the book and the world disagree, believe the world. He kept that faith for 77 years, through poverty, through glory, through a courtroom, through blindness, all the way to a hillside of olive trees, and the universe he left behind was larger, stranger, and more honest than the one he was born into. Our story is almost over now, and the night outside your window is the same night he knew. That is the quiet gift of this particular life. The evidence never went away. Jupiter is up there somewhere tonight, and the 4 moons are still circling, just as they circled on the 7th of January, 1610. Whether or not anyone is watching, Venus is still running through her phases. The moon still catches the sunrise on her mountains, peak by peak, exactly as a tired professor in Padua saw it through a tube of wood and leather he built with his own hands. So as you drift toward sleep, let the courtroom fade first. Let the white shirt and the reading of the sentence dissolve. Let Rome grow small and far away. Keep, if you keep anything, the window in Padua, the cold night air, the old lute leaning in the corner of a house in Arcetri, and a daughter's letters tied with string. Keep the sound of a chisel on stone, and a pendulum, swinging somewhere in the dark, keeping perfect time. The man is gone, the method remains, the sky is still open, and it still answers anyone patient enough to look twice. If tonight's journey earned a place in your evenings, Legends Uncovered tells one great life at a time, and we would be glad to have you with us for the next one. And before you sleep, one small question to dream on. If you could point his telescope at one thing tonight, what would you choose? Rest well, and let the stars keep watch until morning.